371 BC. The most feared army in Greece had dominated the battlefield for generations. Its warriors were legendary, its discipline unmatched. Its enemies had learned to fear the sight of Spartan shields approaching across the battlefield. But on that day, on the plain of Leuctra, everything changed. For the first time, the Spartan system would face an enemy that understood exactly how to break it, and Sparta would never be the same again. This is the last day of Sparta. Ancient Greece was divided into many city-states. Athens became famous for art, philosophy, and democracy. Corinth grew wealthy through trade. Olympia became home to the ancient Olympic Games. But Sparta was different. Sparta was not built around art, it was not built around philosophy, it was built around war. From an early period, Spartan society developed along a path unlike almost anywhere else in Greece. While other cities invested in trade, architecture, and culture, Sparta devoted itself to one goal: creating warriors. From childhood, Spartan boys were prepared for a life of discipline. Ancient writers claimed that newborn children were inspected by elders and that those considered too weak to survive were abandoned. How literally this happened is still debated today, but what is certain is that Spartan childhood was harsh. At the age of 7, boys entered the Agoge, Sparta's famous state-controlled education and training system. They learned obedience, endurance, combat, and survival. They were given simple clothing, even during the cold months. Food was deliberately limited. They were encouraged to steal, but punished if they were caught, because the lesson was not simply to steal, it was to avoid failure. Spartan stories celebrated boys who endured extraordinary pain without making a sound. Whether every story was true or not, the message was unmistakable. A Spartan warrior was expected to endure. At around 18, young men entered military service. Full citizenship came later, and for decades, their lives remained tied to the army. To be Spartan was to be prepared for war at any moment against any enemy until old age, and that system created one of the most feared military cultures of the ancient world. 480 BC, the Persian king Xerxes invaded Greece with an enormous army. Greek cities faced one of the greatest threats in their history, and at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, a small Greek force stood in the Persian path. At its center were 300 Spartans led by King Leonidas. For days, the defenders held the pass. The terrain was narrow, preventing the Persians from fully using their numerical advantage. Again and again, Persian forces attacked. Again and again, the Greek line held. Then, a local man revealed a mountain path that allowed Persian forces to move behind the defenders. Leonidas understood what was coming. Many of the Greek soldiers were sent away, but Leonidas, his Spartans, and several hundred other Greek allies remained. They refused to retreat. They fought until they were overwhelmed. Leonidas died. The Spartans died, and Thermopylae became one of history's most famous last stands. Their sacrifice did not defeat Persia by itself, but it became a symbol of resistance, discipline, and the willingness to die rather than surrender. Sparta's reputation grew. Decades later, its greatest political triumph arrived. In 404 BC, Sparta defeated Athens in the Peloponnesian War. Athens surrendered, its empire collapsed, and Sparta emerged as the dominant power in Greece. This was Sparta's golden age, but the golden age would be surprisingly short, because Sparta's greatest strength was also becoming its greatest weakness. Its population, full Spartan citizens, the Spartiates, were always a small elite. Each one was expected to be a professional warrior, but their numbers were declining. War took its toll. Economic inequality pushed some families out of full citizenship, and the strict requirements of Spartan society made replacing those losses difficult. Over generations, the number of full Spartan citizens fell dramatically. By the 4th century BC, Sparta could no longer field the vast citizen armies of its past. The system that had created an elite warrior class was slowly running out of warriors, and somewhere to the north, another Greek city was watching. Thebes. For years, Thebes had lived in the shadow of larger powers, but now it had produced an extraordinary commander, Epaminondas, and Epaminondas believed he had discovered how to defeat Sparta. The Spartan battle line had a reputation for being almost impossible to break. Its strongest troops traditionally stood on the right. Spartan discipline, training, and cohesion allowed this wing to smash into the enemy line. For generations, the system had worked. But Epaminondas refused to fight the battle Sparta expected. He developed a radically different formation. Instead of spreading his strongest troops evenly across the battlefield, he concentrated enormous strength on his left wing. Dozens of ranks deep, a massive column of Theban soldiers aimed directly at the strongest part of the Spartan line, not at Sparta's weakness, at its strength. 371 BC, the plain of Leuctra. The Spartan army stood opposite the Thebans. King Cleombrotus commanded the Spartan forces. He expected another traditional Greek battle, 2 lines of hoplites advancing toward one another, shield against shield, spear against spear. But Epaminondas had prepared something different. The Theban left wing, formed in extraordinary depth, advanced directly toward the Spartan right. The impact was devastating. The Spartans found themselves facing pressure unlike anything they had expected. The dense Theban formation drove forward, ranks behind ranks, pushing into Sparta's best warriors. For perhaps the first time in generations, the Spartan line began to give ground. Then King Cleombrotus was killed. Around him, Sparta's elite warriors fell. Ancient accounts suggest that hundreds of full Spartan citizens died at Leuctra. For a society already suffering from a severe shortage of citizens, the losses were catastrophic. In a single battle, Sparta had lost men it could not replace, but the psychological damage was even greater. Sparta had built its identity around one belief: Spartan warriors did not break. At Leuctra, they broke. The legend of Spartan invincibility was shattered, and Epaminondas was not finished. After Leuctra, Epaminondas marched into the Peloponnese, toward the heart of Spartan power. For centuries, Sparta had depended on a population known as the Helots. The Helots worked the land. They produced much of Sparta's food. Their labor allowed Spartan citizens to spend their lives training for war. And the most important Helot population lived in Messenia. Then, Epaminondas changed everything. He helped restore an independent Messenian state. Thousands of people who had lived under Spartan domination were now outside Spartan control. For Sparta, this was devastating. Its military power had already been weakened. Now, its economic foundation was collapsing as well. Without Messenia, Sparta lost land, wealth, labour, and manpower. The city that had once dominated Greece became a regional power. Then, a new force appeared in the north. Macedonia. King Philip II had transformed the Macedonian army. Beside him stood his young son, Alexander. In 338 BC, Philip defeated a coalition of Greek states at the Battle of Chaeronea. Athens was defeated. Thebes was defeated. Macedonia became the dominant power in Greece. Sparta had not joined the battle, and according to a famous later tradition, Philip sent Sparta a threatening message. If he entered Laconia, he warned he would destroy their lands and crush their city. The Spartans supposedly answered with a single word, if. A perfect Spartan response, short, defiant, fearless, but the reality was different. Sparta could still speak like the great military power of the past, but it could no longer dominate Greece. Its age of supremacy was over. In 146 BC, Rome completed its conquest of Greece. The Greek world fell under Roman power. Sparta was no exception. But something strange happened. The Romans admired Sparta. They admired its military reputation, its discipline, its ancient traditions, and the stories of warriors like Leonidas. Under Roman rule, Sparta retained elements of its local identity. Ancient customs survived. Visitors came to see the city that had once produced Greece's most feared soldiers. Some Spartan traditions, which had once been part of a living military society, became public spectacles. Rituals connected to the old Spartan training system attracted spectators. The warrior state had become something very different, a living monument to its own past. Centuries earlier, Sparta had terrified Greece. Now, people travelled there to watch echoes of what Sparta had once been. Then, in the late 4th century AD, the ancient Greek world faced new invasions. In 396 AD, the Visigothic king Alaric swept through Greece. Sparta was attacked. By then, the city that had once sent armies across Greece was only a shadow of its former power. The Sparta of Leonidas, Cleombrotus, and the ancient warrior elite belonged to history. But its name did not disappear, because Sparta left behind something far more powerful than an empire. It left behind an idea. Sparta's legacy is filled with contradictions. It did not become famous for philosophy like Athens. It did not leave behind monuments on the scale of Egypt or Rome. Its greatest achievement was not architecture. It was not literature. It was not art. And yet, 2,500 years later, the entire world still knows the name, Sparta. Why? Because Sparta came to represent an idea, discipline, endurance, sacrifice, and the willingness to stand your ground until the very end. The warriors who died at Thermopylae are still remembered thousands of years later. The word Spartan itself still survives in modern English. It means something simple, austere, without luxury, a life stripped down to what is necessary. Modern military culture still draws inspiration from the image of Spartan discipline. And around the world, people compete in endurance events, carrying the Spartan name. The historical Sparta disappeared, but the idea of Sparta survived. Ancient stories even described Spartan families reacting to death in ways that seem almost unimaginable today. Victory mattered more than survival, duty more than comfort, honor more than fear. To the modern world, that mentality can seem brutal. And in many ways it was. Spartan society demanded extraordinary sacrifice from its citizens, and even greater suffering from the people it controlled. But that harshness became part of its legend. Sparta was hard, hard as stone, hard as bronze, hard as the shields its warriors carried into battle. And perhaps that is why, even after 2,500 years, we still cannot look away. At Leuctra, Sparta lost more than a battle. It lost the belief that it could never be defeated. And once that belief was gone, the world around Sparta began to change. The warriors disappeared, the empire disappeared, the old system disappeared. But the name remained. Sparta. If you enjoyed this video, press the like button and subscribe to the Ancient Atlas. The Last Days series continues. Stay with us.